But for now, let's get smarter with the help of our leadoff panel. Michael Schnell is here, MS Now congressional reporter, Sam Stein, managing editor for The Bulwark, and lucky us, MS Now political contributor, and Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia and an MS Now international affairs analyst. Ambassador, the president has repeatedly said this thing was going to be over in just a couple of weeks, and here we are. What are you watching today while Trump meets with Netanyahu? This thing is fraught. There are so many stakeholders here in the U.S. and abroad who want us out of this thing.
Well, as you just set it up, the two leaders have a different point of view now on the war. Netanyahu wants it to continue it. He wants to escalate. And what I'm looking for, will he be persuasive in interacting with the president to convince him of those arguments? We know that this president it can be rather erratic depending on who is the last person he talked to. And that's what I'm going to be watching for. And I'm hoping that he will not be successful. Because we are now, as you said, several months into this war. It is not clear. There is no strategy that escalation will lead to a different outcome that I have been convinced by. And I hope President Trump, therefore, won't be convinced by it today as well.
Sam, Politico is reporting something that should come as no surprise to anyone. The America First wing of the GOP is not happy about this meeting. They're worried Netanyahu will yet again convince Trump to stay in these attacks, potentially ramp them up. Many people are still angry about that reported meeting they had in the White House, in the Situation Room, where they were basically sitting across from one another as peers, and it was Netanyahu who convinced Trump to jump in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, they're right to have those fears. As the ambassador notes, Trump tends to follow the advice of the last person he talks to. And if Netanyahu is in the room, then you can conceive that Netanyahu is going to encourage him to get more forcefully involved in Iran. On the flip side, though, it's really apparent at this juncture that Trump is just absolutely done with this war. He spoke on Fox and Friends this morning. And he was open about the idea that Netanyahu is going to try to bait him into going further. But it's very clear from the tenor of the remarks and the tone and the content of the remarks, that he's looking for an off-ramp here. The problem, of course, is that there's not really a convenient one to have. He's made pledges that Iran will not be able to constitute its nuclear program and that the Strait of Hormuz will be open, that any deal that he strikes will be better in terms of the JCPOA. It's unclear how any of that actually can be achieved from this posture that he has, from this negotiating position that he has. So I guess Netanyahu has a little bit of opening, but I don't think it's much.
Okay, but Sam, take me to that Fox and Friends audience. How much are they losing faith in him around this war, right? He is trying to convince America that he alone rebuilt the military, and at the same time, we've got no weapons and it's Joe Biden's fault. Who out there is saying, right on, sir, I believe you, and telling their friends and family these lies?
Well, a good portion of the base is, right? Like there's always going to be a portion of that MAGA base that if Trump tells them the sky's green, they'll say, wow, that's remarkable. And how did you do it, sir? If you do look at the opinion polls, at the same time, there is a clear softening of support there. And part of that is because this has gone on a lot longer than they were told, and we can all read the news, but also we can see the price of gas as we drive. And I think a good chunk of the MAGA base is saying this is not worth the cost. You can see, support further eroding there too. He'll retain a fair bit forever just because that's the nature of his followers. But there is a softening of support, enough so that he's willing to go on Fox and just say, yeah, we're looking for more or less, I'm done with this.
Michael, take us to the Hill, because there's a lot of reporting out there that says Pete Hegseth is losing Republican support from GOP senators as this war drags on. Is that going to amount to anything?
Well, Republicans, Steph, are becoming just sick and tired of this war overall. We saw that vote on the War Powers Resolution in the House last week, and there were those 4 Republicans who voted in favor of it. It's worth noting they were the same 4 Republicans who voted for it last time, so there was no elevated GOP support. But the place where you really strike a nerve among Republicans when it comes to this war are gas prices. Republicans are very vulnerable heading into the November midterm elections. I was talking to one House Republican recently who said that those gas prices are 2 foot high signs that are difficult to ignore, near impossible for voters to ignore. And with Republicans controlling all levers of power right now in Washington, Republicans are keenly aware and concerned that they are going to get the blowback from voters. So it falls on President Trump. It falls on Secretary Pete Hegseth. But the political ramifications here are really where it's hitting Republicans the hardest. And as we inch closer to November, less than 100 days away, that concern is becoming very acute.
It's also worth noting that Michael looks like she is in the opening scene of The Wizard of Oz right now.
Yes.
As two foreign leaders are descending on Washington who are both involved in foreign wars. That's noteworthy. All right, let's talk about one of them. I want to talk about Zelensky's visit. Ambassador, what are you looking for? What are you hoping for? Yes, the meeting last month in France was positive, but we can never forget the awful meeting that took place in the White House last year.
Exactly. And that's why what I'm hoping for is no news. I hope it's just a boring meeting. Nobody's going to report on it. There won't be any press in the room. I think that's the best that Zelensky can hope for in terms of the public messaging. And then the private messaging, it is better. And it's better for a really important reason I think needs to be stressed. It's better because today the Trump administration is no longer trying to convince Zelensky to give up Donbass. I think now when we put together the reporting, I think that was pledged. I think that was promised in the Alaska meeting. You read what Putin and his people have said, Foreign Minister Lavrov. They thought that's what they got. And we had to endure months of pressure on Zelensky to take that deal. And he resisted it. And now they've moved away from it. I think that's really good news. The challenge now, of course, can they get a different deal without Donbass? I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen anytime soon, but not having that pressure on Zelensky means that this could be a positive meeting. That is no news, I think, is good news at this point.
Well, yesterday the president was asked about Zelensky's recent claim that Russia is helping Iran target American bases. Watch this.
We'll find out if that's true. I'll ask Putin about it. We'll find out. Hasn't had much impact because we've knocked the hell out of him, when you think. If that's the case.
Okay, so the president said it has not had much impact, yet 18 service members have lost their lives. Ambassador, why is Trump's first answer always that he's going to ask Putin about it? And why won't he at least say that if it's true, this is a huge problem?
Well, first, Russia and Iran are allies. They coordinate. They sell weapons together. I can't imagine that there's not intelligence sharing. I don't have privy to secret information anymore. That's first. Number two, what is he saying? We'll find out. How come he doesn't know? Maybe we should be increasing our intelligence community and strengthening it rather than gutting it in some kind of purge that's going on now. And then third, I'm going to ask Putin. Seriously? Putin's never going to tell him the truth on that. And the very notion that he sets it up, that's how he's going to find out whether it's truth or not. It's just shocking to me that he continues to say things like that. And I think it's embarrassing for him. I think it's such a weak look that he says things like that. I don't understand why his team doesn't explain to him, Mr. President, you look weak when you make statements like that.
And how might Ukraine targeting an Iranian ship in the Caspian Sea over the weekend, how could that impact both wars, Mr. Ambassador?
That was an audacious move. And I think you're seeing that, remember a year ago, you showed clips of it. President Trump said, you don't have any cards, Zelensky. You don't have any cards. They've got a lot of cards right now. Their production of long-range drones, long-range missiles, 7 million they're predicting in 2026, means that they can do things deep inside Russia that has changed the balance of power in the war and the perception. And that, I think, will be a topic of the conversation today. And I hope it means that Trump will get further behind President Zelensky. There are things he can do, including providing more interceptors. By the way, we used to provide military assistance to Ukraine. We don't talk about that anymore, but Trump cut that. He drove it down to near zero. He could do that as well, because I think the tide has changed. It doesn't mean the Ukrainians are going to win this war in the next few months. Let's not be naive about that. But the notion that they don't have any cards, they have cards. They can strike all the way to the Caspian Sea.
Michael, today in Washington, they will be honoring the life of Lindsey Graham. That is why these two world leaders are in town. Obviously, Lindsey Graham was a major advocate for Ukraine. Where does support for Ukraine on the Hill stand right now? Will there be someone to take Lindsey Graham's place?
That's the big question, Steph. And I think that President Zelensky is keenly aware that that question still has to be answered. There's now a massive vacuum in terms of somebody who is in President Trump's ear, somebody who the president listens to and trusts, who is in favor of Ukraine and supporting Ukraine against its war with Iran. Now, notably, President Zelensky is going to be meeting with all senators later tonight after the funeral, likely to make his case and potentially look for that new interlocker between himself and President Trump. It's also worth noting that later today, the Senate is going to take the first procedural vote on an Iran and Russia sanctions bill. It's something that Lindsey Graham has been working on for months, that had a number of starts and stops. But now there is a compromise piece of legislation. It's going to need 60 votes to advance. So how many votes that gets and whether it breaks that 60 vote threshold will be a big determiner of what exactly is the support among GOP ranks right now for Ukraine. But certainly right now, Lindsey Graham's absence is going to be felt for a number of reasons, whether it's the political issues that happen on Capitol Hill, being again that interlocker between President Trump and Republicans in the Senate. But one of the biggest things is going to be his presence on the international stage, since he was an advisor for President Trump on so many different issues, particularly when it came to the war with Ukraine and particularly supporting Ukraine in that war at times when it seemed like the president's support may have been waning.